Three-question reply speech. So the first question is going to be, can authoritarian regimes rule well? The second question is, can governments change naturally? And thirdly, what are the impacts of an imposed democracy? So can authoritarian regimes rule well? What we would say, ladies and gentlemen, is that yes, they can. What we heard from that proposition was really no response. What we would say is that dictators make efficient decisions because they have a small group of advisors or specialists in that field, and they can actually advise this one man to make his decision based upon his own gut because of research might actually inform a group of individuals. We think that many dictatorships, many authoritarian regimes have actually led their countries to prosperity, economically and socially. Places like China, places like Libya, Egypt, those places did have good economies. They did have good economic growth. We think that in those cases, many people did prosper under that regime. We think that in these cases, we shouldn't be imposing democracies through a land invasion or an inner invasion just because some people who know how to use the internet suddenly start posting things about how they don't like the quality of life. We think that in many cases, dictatorships have led countries to global prosperity. I think in these cases, some people have actually prospered. So let's move into the second question, this idea of can governments change naturally? And what we would say, ladies and gentlemen, is that yes, that global technology through the internet does enable countries to change naturally through the people's own will. I think that these examples exist like Libya and Egypt. So why do we need an invasion? And what they've really told us is that we need an invasion because we just need to show off our military strength, like the USA always does. Well, what we would say is that it really only leads to protracted guerrilla warfare. And when you have a population that prospered under this dictatorship, who oppose the views of the West, those views are just as legitimate as views that support the West. We think that in this case, protracted guerrilla warfare does not lead to stability in that region. We think that it only leads to protracted warfare at the sacrifice of our own military personnel. What we also told you, though, is that unnatural change actually imposes a government that's not really wanted by some people, and that it actually imposes leadership on people that's really not there. We think that in Iraq, when we actually imposed democracies on that country, we actually brought in a leader that was educated at Harvard and at Oxford. What happened to this guy? Well, everybody hated him in Iraq, okay? But in essence, what we did was we imposed a democracy that wasn't ready to have a democracy. We think that change needs to happen naturally. We think that in that case, governments that are established actually have the leadership that is supported by the people because it's actually introduced to the people and voted by the people. We think that that didn't happen in Iraq. We think that that's going to continue to happen if we invade countries just to put in a figurehead who is the leader. So let's look at this third idea. What are the impacts of imposed democracies? Well, we think that it really goes against the sovereignty of nations. We really don't think that we should be invading countries just because some people in that country don't accept the views of the government. We think that happens even in a democracy. We think that even in a democracy, we have people who did vote for the conservatives, and they actually have a number of people who did. So we really think that in this case, it's not really fair for us to assume that just because the West is right, that we should invade countries to support the people who support the West. We really don't think that's right. What we also think is that by imposing democracy, we're not actually really being democratic, because by imposing democracies, we're imposing something that might not be wanted by the large majority of that population. What we also told you is that we really can't assume that a large percentage of the population likes the government or doesn't like the government. We think that's something that the government needs to work out itself. We think that if there's significant opposition, that governments can't change naturally because of people's revolutions, we really don't see the need to actually invade a country just to support the views of a certain portion of the population who knows how to use the internet. So ladies and gentlemen, what have we told you today? Well, we've told you that authoritarian regimes can be good. We told you that there are consequences of imposing governments that can't be really assessed right now. We also told you that democracies should be imposed naturally, not based upon an invasion against the sovereignty of a nation. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's very hard for the people to express their will when there are other people who have tanks pointed at them. That's what we're saying here on side proposition. We've heard probably 30 times from side opposition today that the people should be allowed to choose their government system. Ladies and gentlemen, the people aren't choosing their government system when the government system is being placed on them by force. And that is in fact exactly what we support on side proposition. When the people want a democratic government system, we say give it to them and remove the ability of people to use force in order to stop democracy. So ladies and gentlemen, during this reply speech, I'm going to be answering two basic questions. Firstly, which is better, democracy or authoritarian regimes? And secondly, what constitutes people who want to oppose their oppressive regime? And I think with the answers to those two questions, we'll also be able to find the answer to this resolution. So first, let's talk about democracy versus authoritarianism. So that obviously is a very interesting tack to this debate and try to tell us that sometimes dictatorships are better than democracies. And a couple of questions for that. Let's start off with some logic. So what incentives are there for a government that is authoritarian? Their incentive is to centralize their power in order to stop people from having freedom of speech, freedom of movement, so that they can keep control. Their incentive is to move the power into a small group of people and to keep the money with a small group of people. Whereas in a democracy where the people actually control the government, the incentives are to move the money to a lot of people, to have as many people be happy as possible, to support freedom. So logically, we would expect that democracies would be better. Also, as my partner told you, democracies have more legitimacy on the world stage because they're unable to be brought down by other governments. They have the legitimacy of the people's will backing up their statements, as opposed to being able to be harangued or disagreed with simply as one man's opinion. So they have more legitimacy, and logically, they ought to work better. But do they? Well, side opposition seems to be a huge fan of dictatorships, but the most developed countries in the world, they're all democracies. It's not a shocking twist that the highest human development index, the highest GDP countries, the highest quality of living countries, they're democracies, ladies and gentlemen. So I think it's pretty obvious from what we see in this debate that democracy is the preferable system of government in most cases. Now let's see, what do we mean when we say people deposing an oppressive regime? Ladies and gentlemen, it doesn't mean that there are some people who don't like government and some people who do. It means that 5% of the people who are the theocracy, the autocrats, they've got a lot of power, they're happy, but a vast majority of the population, let's say 95%, don't like the government. So 5% do, 95% don't. Why then do the 5% have power? Then you don't, because the 5% have all the guns and the 95% have none of them. Now this is an important distinction. We say that we need this condition where all power is going with keeping a small group of people in control, and the second distinction, that there's a strong sign saying that the people want to take power. So, let's look at the examples we've seen from either side. On our side, we told you about Libya and about Syria. In Libya and Syria, there were huge protests, massive support for the opposition, and a small number of people with a lot of guns, mostly the military institution, supporting the government. That fits under our qualification. We believe that stopping the fighting there would be very beneficial. What was said in the other cases given up by side opposition? Well, they told us about Iraq. We didn't invade Iraq to free people, we invaded Iraq because it was mass destruction. Well, then they moved on to Afghanistan. And we didn't invade Afghanistan to free people, we invaded Afghanistan because they were harboring terrorists. Ladies and gentlemen, the invasions here were not set because there was a strong sign from the people saying, we want freedom with the West. It was because the West had interest in those countries. And additionally, as they told us, the West largely installed figureheads and not democracy. So that also makes them not really an evaluation of how effective true democracy is. Ladies and gentlemen, what's the difference here? If you take the tanks away from the people with power, then give power to the rest, you'd suddenly have freedom. In countries where you don't have that large discrepancy, it doesn't work. But in countries where the people want freedom, don't let the tanks stand in the way. Thank you.